Today we have Mike Rhyne with us. For those of you who have come to other programs that we have held here in the library, we have put Mike up as the expert on many topics, but today, finally, we truly get to let him be the expert for us in a topic where he has been recognized as an expert. He won the Richard H. Collins Award for the most outstanding contribution to Kentucky history, recognizing his article of Blood-Stained Sin, Slavery, Freedom, and Guerrilla Warfare in the Bluegrass region of Kentucky, 1863 to 1865. Dr. Rhyne has a PhD in history from the University of Cincinnati. He teaches courses for us here in U.S. history, U.S. social and cultural history, and U.S. women's history. And we are excited to hear today, although it's a very sad story, the Negroes are no longer slaves, the problem of freedom in post-emancipation Kentucky.
This is water. I'm talking about Kentucky. Okay, there's your humor for you. You know, if you've ever been in one of my classes, there's always an alcohol joke somewhere. I joke about when you become a historian of Kentucky, you can follow several routes. You can focus on horses, you can focus on basketball, or you can focus on bourbon. So I consider myself a historian of bourbon, and of course, the original product that is not aged one day, that Kentucky is also well known for, White Lightning. I told Margaret Piatt at the beginning that I was going to do something I normally don't do. I love sort of freewheeling, extemporaneous kinds of talks or using PowerPoints and things, but I've worked with this material for 16 years, and the scope of what I know that I can't fit into a presentation is several book links, right? So I'm going to actually do a manuscript presentation in the form of traditional academic presentations. So I apologize for all the reading, but it's absolutely essential to keep the material organized in a timely manner. I also know that many of you are going to need to leave for 1 o'clock classes, and I didn't intend to talk until 1 o'clock anyway, so hopefully we can have some Q&A afterwards, but hopefully we'll get you to those classes in plenty of time. Well, in the summer of 1866, a young girl named Jenny Addison, age 12, along with her mother, were employed by a man named James C. Ford as domestic help. They testified to an agent of the Freedmen's Bureau in the Freedmen's Bureau's Louisville sub-district that Mrs. Ford had ordered a male employee to beat Jenny up on several occasions, again 12 years old. During the worst of these beatings, quote, the man struck her 7 or 8 times with his fist, saying that he was authorized by Ford's wife to inflict such punishment. The Freedmen's Bureau, on which the federal government placed responsibility for helping Kentucky's approximately 200,000 former slaves transition to freed people and free laborers on the labor market, struggled mightily to mitigate racial violence such as this in the workplace, in the home place, and elsewhere. In this case, James C. Ford, as head of household, was ordered to appear before the Bureau to answer charges. He was cautioned at that time to remember, quote, Negroes are no longer slaves, and the law does not permit them to be beaten and abused in this manner, either by the persons hiring them or by any person they may also have employed. Despite the violent nature of such cases, most of them don't constitute illegal activities, okay? That's the way you have to think about this, is that the courts aren't going to hear these cases. Most of them are considered to be too mild to take before any sort of court. Also, the U.S. District Court is the court that has to hear these cases. It's often called the court of last resort for African Americans who are trying to take white assailants to trial. The reason for this is that Kentucky law prohibits black testimony against white defendants in state courts. So virtually all judges in Kentucky refuse to hear black testimony in these cases. Anytime a case comes before them involving black testimony, the judge typically rules that he can't hear the case, and at that time, then it can go before the federal district court. So you can imagine the district court in Louisville has a heavy backlog. They can't hear these kinds of cases. They're busy with rape and murder and that sort of thing. And even rape is a case that often isn't considered prosecutable at the district court level. So the Freedmen's Bureau, operating in that context, is in the Commonwealth from late 1865 through 1868. And they try to intervene as best they can, investigating reports of murder, violent intimidation, house burning, and much more, including cases such as this that did not result in long-term injury or fatal injury to the victim. Bureau superintendents, understanding the limits of legal resources for free people, establish a system of fines, trying to use economic pressure on white assailants in that manner, and heads of household like James C. Ford in that manner. And so it is that the case of Jenny Addison comes before the court, fine is levied, and then the people try to move on from that point. Despite such fines, the transition to free labor for former slaves that the Freedmen's Bureau hopes to facilitate will face violent opposition from former slaveholders and stubborn white employers who, along with self-styled vigilantes, act out their deep-seated notions of white supremacy with little reason to fear prosecution at local, state, or even federal levels. Indeed, one side note is the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was aimed particularly at Kentucky, as well as some of my students will know, aimed at overturning the black codes in southern states, but particularly in Kentucky, that act was put in place. Former slaves in Kentucky make up approximately 1/5 of the population. That's about 200,000, again, of a population of 1 million in 1860. And they frequently had little ability to enjoy their hard-won freedom in the first months and years after emancipation. Self-proclaimed Negro regulators imposed a reign of terror using the language of the day, the language that the Freedmen's Bureau used and that locals used. They called this a reign of terror on many communities. In particular, families, sometimes with male heads of households, sometimes not, bore the brunt of this violence and faced significant hurdles as they sought to establish autonomous lives. Bands of white supremacists pillaged homes, burned people out of them, sometimes violently abused them. At the same time, many masters proved to be reluctant in releasing their slaves or accepting freedom as a fact at all. They openly defied federal policy, openly defied federal authority, and resisted emancipation well into 1866. Freed people expressed great frustration with the disruptive, racially biased system of apprenticeship as well, as women complained particularly of their children being bound as apprentices to former masters, even though that wasn't supposed to happen. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Taken all together, these kinds of limits, both illegal, extra-legal, and legal, imposed on the emancipated slaves, coupled with the acts of violence associated, constitute a concerted effort to maintain black subordination. That's my central argument in this case, that this is the enactment of white supremacy to maintain black subordination after emancipation. Thereby, they hope to deny the former slaves free and potentially equal status. The status slaves desired, what they expected, what they demanded. That was the intent. The stories of these freed women and children in particular, told through the documents of the Freedmen's Bureau, as these individuals attempted to gain redress for abuses against them, bring to light the unique challenges that freed people faced in this transition. And just an aside here, another central argument that I make about Kentucky, I started studying Kentucky with the idea that this is a unique space, right? but I've come to the conclusion, quite the opposite now, that Kentucky is in fact a microcosm of the larger struggle of Civil War, emancipation, Reconstruction. And so that sort of has flipped my research in a way that's exciting, and hopefully I can finally get that manuscript finished that I've been promising people for 5 years at Urbana that I would get finished. But when I do, I'm sure you'll be the first to hear about it on Facebook, Robert and Susie and et cetera. Well, one difference is, of course, Kentucky never seceded as a whole. Part of Kentucky seceded in fact, but as a whole, the state never did. What that does for Reconstruction is it presents a problem. Kentucky and Tennessee are kind of unique in that sense, in that Tennessee had seceded, but it had reconstructed itself. And so it doesn't have congressional Reconstruction imposed upon it. And Kentucky doesn't either because it had never seceded. Maryland in the same sort of situation. But as war came to Kentucky, attitudes and opinions in Kentucky do begin to shift. Initially, many Kentuckians see themselves in the model of Henry Clay. They are unconditional unionists. They don't believe in secession. They don't believe in tearing the Union apart. And many Kentuckians will eventually volunteer to serve in the Union Army. Of course, many more go south and serve in the Confederate Army. Again, the microcosm factor that Kentucky itself is a state divided, even as our nation is divided. But as the war progresses, as federal policy changes, reports begin to emerge. And particularly from the bluegrass region, we begin to see reports of frustration with federal policy. The bluegrass being the original slaveholding part of Kentucky, the oldest, the most storied slaveholding part, and also the center of hemp production in the 1840s and 50s. Hemp was perceived as a slave crop. Okay, that it's just not something that white laborers were going to mess with, and you had to have slaves to make it profitable. So a lot of slaves in central Kentucky because of the hemp industry, and therefore loss of slave property is going to be significant. If you think about it this way, Kentucky has 200,000 slaves approximately. The census of 1860 tells us that about half those slaves are 15 years old or younger. You think about that in economic terms. That's 100,000 people with a rough value of maybe as much as $1,000 a piece on the market down in the cotton states, okay, per maybe 1850 prices. That's a huge financial investment that is not mature. It's not ready to sell to market. And if you think about that, as slaveholders did, then you understand the reluctance to see slavery destroyed by many Kentucky slaveholders. So as the war progresses, and as Lincoln issues his Emancipation Proclamation, which excludes Kentucky, but it scares Kentuckians because that's federal authority stepping in to say, we can and will take slaves away from people who are in rebellion. That scares Kentuckians a great deal. And then federal policy utilizing slave labor, impressing slaves to work on road building, railroad building, and finally, freeing slaves who want to fight in the United States colored troops. Kentucky initially excluded from recruitment, but by 1864 recruitment is well underway. That's the first article Julie referenced really focuses on that story of how recruitment of slaves for the USCT sets off a firestorm of violence in response. All of that takes place long before emancipation becomes a reality. Slavery ends formally in Kentucky, I believe it's December 17th, 1865, when the 13th Amendment is ratified. So jumping forward to that point then, where we're dealing with Kentucky that has fought against the 13th Amendment, refused to ratify it, and in point of fact had sued in federal court to try to block emancipation as a reality. Now it's a reality. It's at that point that it becomes clear to the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, Oliver O. Howard. My Civil War students will remember that he was the hapless O. Howard, whose divisions were often routed in key battles, like Chancellorsville and the first day at Gettysburg. He becomes head of the Freedmen's Bureau, and he contacts the head of the Tennessee branch of the Bureau, Clinton Fisk, after whom Fisk University is named, and says, you've got to go investigate Kentucky. We're getting all these reports of violence. Fisk goes to Kentucky. February or March 1866, he conducts extensive investigations. Military and civilian inspectors log cases throughout the Bluegrass region in particular of women and girls being beaten, being raped, freedmen being assaulted, sometimes shot or lynched, or in the case of one hapless soul, roasted alive, front and back, and then taken off the coals to allow to die. Those kinds of cases get your attention when you read through the records. They stick with your dreams for a long time too. Bands of white supremacists frequently targeted whole communities. They targeted community leaders, ministers, returning veterans in particular. In some cases, these bands openly stated they were searching for illegal weapons. Another hurdle that Kentuckians face, black Kentuckians, is there were laws preventing free blacks from owning guns. And so even though you had a significant number, there were about 23,000 Kentuckians who served in the United States colored troops. So significant numbers of returning veterans coming back to the state. They are systematically disarmed. They are met at the train depots. If they have a rifle or pistol, it's taken away from them. If they resist, several of them are shot. Okay? No questions asked. So that's Kentucky law. So these bands of regulators, as they called themselves, would go to communities and would search for weapons. They would beat and intimidate, and sometimes they would outright kill people. As one group of bluegrass freedmen lamented, our houses are pulled down on us and we are turned out of doors in the cold, and we have no protection from the whites in this neighborhood. In the face of this onslaught then, Fisk quickly recruited locals to work in the Bureau. He had that advantage here. He could recruit from local unionists in Kentucky. He noted that he chose such men on the basis of their loyalty to the federal government and upon the recommendation of the best men he could find. Thus, the men most responsible for implementing Bureau policy in most cases were Kentuckians themselves and members of the communities in which they operated. A very different story from the Freedmen's Bureau in the Deep South, for example. Sometimes these men represented opposing factions, though, to the people they were working with, and also they found themselves often confronted by freedmen themselves who had different visions of what freedom should mean. One such case, William Cassius Goodloe, the nephew of the irascible anti-slavery advocate Cassius Marcellus Clay. Don't call him an abolitionist, he'll cut you. Okay? He actually wrote a book on fighting with a bowie knife, so he really would cut you. But anyway, William Cassius Goodloe becomes a Freedmen's Bureau agent and goes to the southern edge of the bluegrass, down to Boyle, Lincoln, and Mercer counties. He says, the country is infested with guerrilla bands, and the outrages most generally are committed on colored persons who are precluded from testimony against them. I am powerless to accomplish anything without soldiers. The people are generally well enough disposed so far as taking a proper view of the labor question is concerned. That means shifting to free labor where the laborers are paid wages as opposed to unfree labor, which is slavery, right? Are well enough disposed to the labor question, but are misled by politicians and seem to think the object of the establishment of the Bureau in Kentucky is to oppress them, to oppress the white population. I found a great deal of vagrancy here, but by the aid of many loyal citizens and the efforts of leaders of the colored population have to a great extent caused it to disappear. In other words, relocating people, getting them employed on farms, and settled in permanent or more permanent jobs and housing. You are quite aware that I have had to grope my way in the dark. the manual promised that I would be hailed as an angel of light. Apparently not. Well, by all appearances, Clinton Fisk simply failed to understand the deep resentment, the animosity among so many white residents in post-emancipation Kentucky. They not only condoned violence, but often viewed it as necessary and legitimate in order to establish community norms in their way of thinking, as opposed to the freed people's way of thinking. Like many former Confederates in the South, Kentucky's white supremacists attempted to construct a post-war society based on the idea that because black people were inferior to white people, and that is an important concept to remember that was deeply held at the time, the two races could not peacefully coexist. White people had to exercise rigid control to prevent what they called race war. And with the 5-to-1 odds in Kentucky, politicians all the way up to the governor, Thomas Bramlett, argued that race war would lead to the extermination of the black population in Kentucky. So they justified limited violence, even extra-legal violence, to maintain order in that post-emancipation reality. For their part, freed people struggled mightily to reconstitute families. Families broken up before the war by selling off people down the river, families broken up during the war as men enlisted in the Army and were deployed in Virginia and elsewhere. They tried to reconstitute these families. They tried to reunite mothers with daughters and sons, husbands with wives as best they can. They often ran into violent resistance. There are many stories of returning veterans trying to go get their wife from where she was enslaved and being shot at, driven off, that sort of thing. It's very common in the records. Well, we see these records coming out of violence and intimidation. The case of Emily Churchill is illustrative. She lived in Jefferson County, the home county to Louisville, and her former master had refused to liberate her two sons, age 10, one, and the other age 4 and also blind. Churchill determined to take matters into her own hands, so she waited. She saw Mr. Atterburn leave the house, Arterburn, and then she went to get her sons. She retrieved the boys, started down the road, but then ran into Arterburn returning, coming back home. So misfortune in that extent. She told him that she was taking her boys, they were no longer slaves. He pulled out a small knife, used it to threaten the children, okay, especially the 10-year-old. Well, the 10-year-old got away from him. If you have 10-year-olds, you know they can do that quite well. And so the 10-year-old got away and ran off into the woods. And that left Churchill and the 4-year-old, the blind 4-year-old. Arterburn turned on Churchill and started beating the woman over the head, knocked her down, hit the 4-year-old twice with his fist, and finally threatened to cut Churchill's throat. At that point, she begged for her life, and he apparently responded favorably, but then had the audacity to turn to her and ask if she would be returning to stay with him and take care of it. She refused and made her way to Louisville. Well, even as Churchill and other parents struggled with that kind of effort to reclaim children from masters who were refusing to set them free, Kentucky also imposed a legal apprenticeship system, and they made it race-specific. There was an apprenticeship system before the war, as there were in most states, but they made this one race-specific, okay? So that for black apprentices, they didn't have the same rights as white apprentices. One of the most heinous policies, supposedly you could not apprentice a child to a former master without the parents' permission, and yet judges routinely did this. Another part of the policy that was different is the whole idea of an apprenticeship, as my students have heard on numerous occasions, is to make the person who's the apprentice employable in the market economy. Teach them skills. That's part of being an apprentice. Teach them literacy, make them literate. Teach them practical skills, even if it's farming, right? I mean, Sorry, farmers. Even if it's working as a field hand, okay, not owning and managing a farm, even if it's working as a field hand, it's a practical skill. Teach them something. You could get out of that. You could get out of even teaching them the basics of reading and writing and any of that simply by paying a one-time fee to the parents. You couldn't do that with a white apprentice, but you could do it with a black apprentice. And then there were many reports of the use of violence against these children. Whippings, beatings, even sexual harassment and things like that were common in the apprenticeship system. The Bureau again sought to mediate these cases, but as was the case with negotiating labor contracts for field hands and tenant farmers, Bureau agents often diverged from the hopes and wishes of the freed people themselves. The Bureau actually supported apprenticeship. It fit with their white middle-class values, that in the case of a family where the mother didn't have visible means of support, right, then they would take the children away, and they would put them with white families as apprentices. The basic assumption, as historian Herbert Gutman has talked about, is that African American parents did not have legitimate households or legitimate rights to their own children. And the Bureau was in league with a lot of white Kentuckians in believing that. So the system led then to much frustration, particularly among freed women. They not only were bearing the brunt of racial violence, but they were also suffering from their children being taken away from them and struggling to survive as female heads of household in the market economy, right, in which jobs were highly limited. One of the few things women could do to survive is to hire themselves and their children out as domestic help. But again, this opens an avenue for abuse. We have cases like Josephine Bedford, who reported to the Bureau, "The man where I've been living for the last 12 months will not pay me anything for my work." So she's worked there as a domestic servant 12 months and has been paid nothing. She says, "I'm a smart, healthy woman." She lives in the home of Colin Egan in Taylorsville. And she wanted to know whether there is any protection by the government for us poor colored people, particularly women such as herself and her daughter, who also lived in the household and who, she said, had been abused very much. White employers typically, when confronted by the Bureau, tried to rationalize non-payment. They downplayed the severity of abuse, frequently said that, oh, they just gave their employee a switching, what somebody would do to a child. That was the typical response. On the other hand, a lot of the affidavits talk about using fists, using sticks, not switches, and things like that. Indeed, white Kentuckians exhibited a fondness for the use of the switch, the stick, the fist, and the cowhide on their black apprentices and hired help. The Bureau dutifully recorded their affidavits, but it could do little more than impose the occasional fine. Additionally, the Bureau appears to have viewed apprenticeship, as I said, and domestic servitude as in keeping with white Victorian middle-class values. You're putting these people in a white household where the white household can model these Victorian values that supposedly the former slaves can't develop on their own. The Bureau proved reluctant to intervene in all but the most serious cases of abuse, even cooperated fully, as I said, with removal of children. Well, added to this is the problem of the self-proclaimed Negro regulators. These groups traveled particularly throughout the southern bluegrass, but also into the heart of the bluegrass. They targeted numerous white unionists, political leaders, organizers. They targeted freed people, particularly, again, community leaders. They also used a wide variety of tools that are reminiscent of guerrilla warfare. They would disarm, they would rob, and in fact, robbery was very common, even among poor black families. Whatever they had, these groups would typically take away from them. There are reports of taking away the bedding, taking the dishes, things that you can't imagine would be worth very much, and nonetheless, they would be robbed of these things. They used whipping very frequently with men. They would often drag out the male head of household, strip his pants off and whip him with a pistol belt. And I argue in the larger context that this is a kind of symbolic emasculation, right? You're proving to him that he's not a man who's your equal, because you dragged him out of the house and you whipped him like this as you would a child, right? And you've exposed him in front of you and whipped him in that manner. So you have that kind of symbolic emasculation, and of course the occasional story, one from down in Bardstown, of dragging a man out of jail and actually castrating him and then making him run down the street while shooting at him. He finally was hit by bullets and fell into the river, and his body was found later. But you do have actual emasculation, but this kind of symbolic emasculation is more common. Another thing that you see is attack on women in the household, and so there are many reports that talk about breaking into the household. In one case, there's a minister and his wife and others in the household. A band of regulators breaks in. They tie the minister up, hold a gun to his head, and then rape his wife right there in front of him. And then they shoot him in the head and kill him. But that kind of thing, they didn't always kill the men. They left them behind with that image of what they had done to their wives and their children. And again, that's telling them, you're not a man. You're not fit to be a man in our world, right? But it's also sending a clear message to black women that they are not fit to be the equals of white women. Systematically attacking black women, raping black women becomes a way of sending a clear message to black families that you are not the equal of white families, and we don't respect you the way that we supposedly respect white women. Of course, rapists will be rapists, and I don't mean to imply otherwise, and these are targets of opportunity. The ability to prosecute a white rapist on the part of a black woman is very, very limited, in Kentucky especially. Now, there is a case down in Memphis of 5 black women being able to testify against white rapists in 1866, but that's very uncommon for Kentucky because of the testimony laws. So in that sense, white women's bodies actually become this battleground, this contested landscape. Black women's bodies do in post-emancipation Kentucky. Even as they are trying to constitute families, okay, their bodies are being contested in this violent contest between white men and the male heads of household. Well, in this context then, to try to wrap things up here in a few minutes, white Kentuckians in general simply refuse to treat freed women as deserving of the basic courtesies and the same level of respect and protection accorded to white women, both in public and in private settings. With such tacit community support, white supremacists hope to demonstrate black inferiority as a reality, and thus the need for continued subordination in multiple ways. In the case of black women, the lesson taught by white men was clear: they are not deserving of the same protection, and they frequently fell victim not only to white men who insulted them, beat them, but also perpetrators of rape. Again, as Herbert Gutman phrased it, ex-slave husbands and fathers found it difficult to protect their wives and daughters from the conventional sexual insult and even abuse that remained after emancipation. Of course, during slavery, it was just accepted. There was no protection. There was no such thing as raping a slave. That law did not exist, okay? Unless you went into somebody else's plantation, maybe and raped a slave, and the master sued you in court for that. But there's no such thing as raping one of your own slaves. The law doesn't exist. And so that practice continues on. Well, if we look at it through this lens, then we can view this contest over the meaning of freedom as a cultural clash between competing perceptions of manhood and womanhood, as well as a social, economic, and political clash. Violence could be used to drive off black competition in the labor market, or it could be used to force free people to sign contracts that were much more favorable to white landholders. And so we have evidence of both of those practices in Kentucky. In general, it seems like the counties that had the smaller black populations simply wanted to make the county white by driving all the black people out of the county. The ones with the bigger populations where you have 3,000 to 6,000 former slaves living in your county, or up to 10,000 maybe, or even 15,000, then you use violence to impose a labor regime in the kinds of ways that Eric Foner talks about in his work on Reconstruction. Using violence as a means to establish a labor regime favorable to the landholders. Well, I'm going to leave you with a quote from the Southern Bluegrass, an area where the Freedmen's Bureau had particular problems. In fact, I started on this project by working on the story of a white Unionist named James Bridgewater, who was assassinated in 1867, an election year in Kentucky. The gubernatorial election was in '67. And he was assassinated. He had a triple whammy. First of all, he was a guerrilla hunter during the war, and he had a notorious reputation for having hunted down and crippled William Clark Quantrell's band and made Quantrell vulnerable eventually to capture himself. So he had that reputation. He had certainly stepped on a lot of toes during the war, taking supplies and even slaves away from people he perceived as Confederate sympathizers. He had then become an investigator for the Freedmen's Bureau, sort of a private eye, if you will, and he had named names. He had given the Freedmen's Bureau a long list of local regulators and their leaders. And then he does the ultimate sin. He becomes an investigator for the IRS. What's the IRS doing there? They're trying to impose a tax on distilled spirits. And down in the knobs of Kentucky and those hills and hollers, you don't impose a tax on distilling, okay? So after all of that, a group of people from Crab Orchard in Lincoln County determined that they better kill Bridgewater, and they do. And then they go back to the local magistrate, they turn themselves in, and they say, but it was in self-defense. He told us he was going to kill all of us. He told old Dan Collier he was going to cut his heart out. We figured we better kill him before he killed us. Magistrate says, self-defense, go home, boys. That's the way local politics worked in that part of the world. So in any event, a Baptist minister with Ohio connections comes through Lincoln County and preaches some sermons there. And I'll leave you with some of his thoughts. The waves of passion that had been raised so high by the winds of war had not yet subsided. What malice, what deep-seated rancor, what hatred of each other. I will not attempt to describe it, for language would fail me. I feel your pain there, minister. It can never be described. And yet he, like myself, continues to try. The fire that had been nursed within was ready to be fanned into a flame and to burst out like a volcano, destroying everything within its reach. I saw the danger and trembled at the consequences. Well, sadly for Kentucky, too few people heard that sermon and took it to heart. And so what we have as a result is that groups of people, whatever their individual motivations, served as regulators, sometimes calling themselves Judge Lynch's men, and other names. These vigilantes brought havoc on their communities. They begat a legacy of retributive justice, as in the case of killing Bridgewater, because he needed a good killing apparently, but they also begat a legacy of racial violence with which Kentucky and the Ohio Valley struggles to this day. The contents of these affidavits, complaints, and reports collected by the Freedmen's Bureau clearly reveal the extreme hostility many white residents of the Commonwealth, including many who fought for the Union during the Civil War, held toward both freed people and federal authorities in the months and years after the ratification of the 13th Amendment. This hostility at times spilled over into violence against white Kentuckians who were political opponents or Freedmen's Bureau agents, and again, Bridgewater was both. In such an environment, it is little wonder that so many former slaves reported being beaten and abused. If one could rationalize regulator violence and even assassination, of what consequence was it reported somebody being beaten or even raped? Inversely, men and women who either condoned or engaged in that kind of daily violence, whipping, beating, that sort of subjugation, either in a fit of anger or as a regular practice. And one guy says to the Freedmen's Bureau, look, she's my servant and she must be whipped, and I'm going to whip her and you're not going to stop me. In that kind of world then, people are enacting white supremacy in their own ways, and that is equally as significant as the regulators, as the vigilantes, as what will become the KKK. That daily enactment of white supremacy is equally significant in its long-term impact. At the very moment when black families are trying to pull together, and many of them succeeding, but many others being destroyed before they can, at that very moment is when the violence reaches its zenith in Kentucky. And from 1868 to 1871, as George Wright has chronicled, that is the zenith of racial violence in Kentucky. At that very moment when free people are trying to exercise their civil rights and then their voting rights, that's when the violence is the worst. The embrace of violence as a legitimate means for establishing and maintaining white supremacy, though it certainly varied in degree, cumulatively served then to disrupt free black households and quash the aspirations of many former slaves, particularly women and children. Though in theory they had been granted equal rights and equal protection under the law, in reality free black families in the Commonwealth had failed to achieve the level of autonomy and prosperity of which they had dreamed when first they were emancipated. Thank you.